Welcome to week three. This is going to be a challenging week for many of you. Chapter three deals with federalism, and in my experience, most students struggle to understand how federalism works. Part of the reason is because while federalism is relatively easy to understand in theory, the practice of federalism is much more complex. Federalism can be thought of as an expression of the vertical separation of powers, meaning that whether a political policy will be centralized and controlled by the federal government or decentralized and given over to the states is often subject to negotiation and actually changes over time. So the way federalism works lends a tremendous amount of authority also to the federal courts. And the courts tend to shift their jurisprudence depending on the appointments process. More liberal judges tend, to create a judiciary that will lead to more liberal interpretations of federalism that tends to give the national government more more power. Uh, More conservative judges appointed, is strongly correlated with more conservative interpretations of federalism, which tend to favor states' rights. Um, that means that there are distinctive periods in which federalism and the fundamental nature of federalism changes. To illustrate, industrialization at the turn of the 19th century fundamentally altered the nature of the American economy in ways that made it virtually impossible for states individually to regulate economic activity. Many of the main drivers of industrialization, banking, mining, the railroads, existed across state boundaries, and the state governments themselves were vulnerable to capture by the powerful interests of their states. And as a result, the federal government over time was compelled to intervene in order to protect consumers and workers and the environment. Another reason why federalism is such a tough subject for students to understand is that the basic rules of federalism are subject to change. It's really important to understand that a federal system of government is fundamentally different from a unitary system, where the government has the authority to dictate policy. And also from a confederation, which, as we learned last week, was the system of government employed by the colonies prior to the adoption of the Constitution, where the central government really has virtually no authority to direct, its constituent governments. The way federalism is practiced in American government means that sovereignty is shared, and that state governments can often resist the imposition of federal laws. As you can see when Republican-controlled states refuse to accept Medicaid expansion under the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. And similarly, in democratically controlled states, you see the rise of sanctuary cities, where the city officials have refused to allow their law enforcement to cooperate with federal immigration officials in rounding up and deporting undocumented immigrants. Um, American, government has witnessed some distinctive eras of federalism. During the 1930s and 40s, federal, state, and local governments worked hard, hand in hand to combat poverty and to help pull the country out of the Great Depression. In the 1960s, as the Johnson administration used the power of the federal government to advance the cause of civil rights and launched the war on poverty, the administration used the coercive power of the federal government to prohibit discrimination. And they often sent money directly to large urban areas to try and help combat urban poverty. The Reagan administration, in the 1980s reflected the conservative opposition to the Johnson administration's interpretation of federalism. When he declared, for example, in his 1981 inaugural address, that government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. So as we'll learn over the course of this week, many of the ideological battles of contemporary politics reflect the ways in which federalism have been interpreted. And liberal and conservative interpretations of federalism reflect these ideological commitments. We have, again, the normal, three assignments that are due: forum, quiz, and submit your study guides. I would also alert you that your first unit exam is next week, so make sure you're beginning to review the material that we've covered to date. And again, be sure to participate in this week's forum and take the quiz and submit the study guide. And remember, always, if you have a question, that's where the forum, really can be useful. If there's anything that's confusing you, I try to read those forum posts every day, and I participate in the forums quite fully. So let's go ahead and get all our work done this week and have a great week.